woman did not scream. She knelt in silence beside the body of her dead master, her hands trembling as she touched his cold chest one last time. Around her, the tribe began to chant. Men, old and young, watched as her white gown was slowly removed, not with violence, but with ritualistic reverence, like priests preparing a sacrifice. She had agreed to this, or at least, that was what everyone claimed. She had spent 3 days in a chamber where food was replaced with wine, and prayers were replaced with hands. Each night, a different man came to her, whispered that he was doing it for the dead chief, and left without a word. Her body, they believed, would carry their life force to the afterlife, delivering vitality to the man they had once followed. When the 6th man left, the old woman entered. She wore black robes, her face painted with ash. She kissed the girl on the forehead and then strangled her with a thick, silken cord while pressing a blade deep between her ribs. The girl's body twitched once, then went still. By dawn, both corpses were placed on a ship, covered in flowers and soaked in oil. A torch was lit, and as flames consumed flesh, the tribe sang of honor, sacrifice, and eternal power. This was not myth. This was not metaphor. This was a real funeral, witnessed in 922 AD by a foreign diplomat whose account would be buried for centuries because no one believed it could be true. For centuries, historians dismissed the account of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, the man who witnessed that chilling Viking funeral, as either exaggeration or enemy propaganda. How could a civilization as influential and widespread as the Vikings embrace rituals so drenched in sexuality and death? But as archaeologists unearthed burial sites with human remains bearing marks of ritual slaughter, and as scholars re-examined Norse sagas and legal texts, a disturbing truth began to take shape. The Vikings were not just seafaring warriors. They were engineers of power who used sexuality as both a language and a weapon. In their world, intimacy was not a private act. It was a tool for control, a symbol of status, and a ritual pathway to honor or humiliation. Sex was legislated with the same precision as land ownership. Masculinity was guarded like a sacred artifact, and violence, both physical and psychological, often wore the mask of ceremony. What modern minds would consider barbaric was, in their eyes, divine order. This is not a story of lust or scandal. It is a story of structure, of how one of the most feared civilizations in history built an empire on the rules of who could touch, who could be touched, and what it meant when those rules were broken. Every detail you are about to hear comes not from fantasy or folklore, but from preserved legal codes, recorded oral histories, and physical evidence buried beneath the cold soil of Northern Europe. These are not myths. These shaped entire civilizations. If you believe that history is written only in battles and blood, prepare to discover that power often lies in what happened behind closed doors, and sometimes in full view of the watching world. In Viking society, sex was never simply about desire. It was a mirror of hierarchy, a battlefield of status, and a declaration of dominance more permanent than any sword wound. Where a man stood in society depended not only on what he conquered with blade and shield, but on his perceived position in the bedroom. The Norse had a word, arg, that carried a weight heavier than most criminal charges. To call a man arg was to brand him sexually passive, effeminate, and therefore unworthy of respect, property, or legal rights. It was more than insult. It was social execution. In medieval Iceland, laws explicitly permitted the killing of anyone who publicly accused another man of sexual passivity, unless the accusation was true, and if it was true, the consequences were swift and ruinous. The man accused might lose his ability to testify in court, inherit land, or even carry a weapon. His masculinity, and therefore his citizenship, was considered void. This sexual binary, active versus passive, formed the backbone of Viking gender expectations. The active partner preserved his honor and status. The passive partner was stripped of both, regardless of consent or context. Whether in same-sex encounters or heterosexual unions, the defining question was never love. It was always power, and power was policed mercilessly. The social consequences of being perceived as sexually submissive did not stop at personal humiliation. They reverberated through the legal, political, and familial structures of Viking life. Reputation was everything, and in a culture where honor could be traded like currency, even a whisper about one's bedroom role could be enough to destroy years of earned respect. The Icelandic sagas tell of men who crossed frozen seas and scaled hostile mountains not for gold or vengeance, but to silence those who had mocked their masculinity. Blood feuds ignited by a single insult, often no more than a jest at another man's softness, consumed entire families. Duels were fought not over land or treasure, but over the preservation of one's sexual reputation. Even more disturbing was how this sexual code infiltrated domestic life. Wives wielded the power of accusation with surgical precision. A woman who wanted to shame her husband could publicly suggest that he was too gentle in bed or that he lacked virility. These were not private grievances. They were public indictments that could unravel a man's standing in his clan. To be a man in Viking society was to be dominant, and to remain dominant, one had to constantly defend that dominance, not only through battle and wealth, but through the performance of sexual aggression and control. It was a system fueled by insecurity and enforced through fear. The obsession with sexual dominance became so deeply embedded in the legal framework of Norse culture that it dictated not only private behavior but public rights. Men who were deemed sexually unworthy, whether through accusation, rumor, or witnessed weakness, could be stripped of their property, exiled from their communities, and denied the most basic civic functions. It was not enough to avoid humiliation. A man had to constantly prove he was not lesser, because the law allowed others to act violently if they believed his masculinity had failed. In some cases, sexual slander was treated with more severity than theft or assault. One man could legally kill another if he was called soft in the wrong tone, and no one would be punished for it. This created a culture of permanent tension. Every gesture, every word, every night spent with a lover carried the weight of potential collapse. Masculinity became a performance that never ended. Men lived in fear not of losing battles, but of losing narrative control over their own identities. Because once labeled as passive, recovery was nearly impossible. It was a stain no victory could erase. What emerged was a system where sex, law, and survival were bound together by a rigid code that rewarded control and punished vulnerability. It was not love that determined one's fate. It was how well one played their role in the theater of dominance. This sexual hierarchy did not exist in isolation. It was mirrored in the structure of Viking slavery, where control over the bodies of others became both a privilege and a performance of status. Unlike free men, enslaved individuals had no legal protection from sexual exploitation. Their consent was irrelevant, their roles predetermined. Slave women, in particular, were reduced to instruments of gratification, bargaining chips, and ritual objects. The law treated them not as people, but as property, subject to exchange, punishment, and use. While free women had limited protections, a slave woman could be raped or killed with little legal consequence, the crime viewed as no more serious than damaging livestock. In this context, sexual dominance was not simply a private act, but a public demonstration of ownership. It was a visible confirmation of power, much like wealth or weapons. The more a man controlled others sexually, the more he affirmed his place at the top of the social order. Even male slaves were not spared. In some sagas, defeated enemies were not killed, but publicly humiliated through symbolic or literal sexual acts meant to strip them of dignity and identity. Submission became a sentence more devastating than death. For the Vikings, the ability to define another person's role in sex was the ultimate expression of command. By establishing an order where dominance equaled virtue and submission equaled shame, Viking society turned intimacy into ideology, one enforced not just by violence, but by law, ritual, and belief. What made this system so enduring was not just fear or brutality, but belief. These were not random cruelties inflicted by the powerful upon the weak. They were expressions of a shared worldview, one that equated control with honor and passivity with spiritual failure. Children were raised to internalize these values. Songs, myths, and stories glorified the man who conquered all things, including his enemies, his household, and his partners. Power was taught in every gesture and expected in every encounter. Even the gods were drawn into this framework. Norse mythology reflected and reinforced the human order. Deities like Odin, Thor, and Freya were not merely divine, they were embodiments of masculine dominance. And when a god like Loki crossed gender lines or embraced a more fluid identity, he was mocked or punished in tales that mirrored the real consequences faced by mortal men. Through religion, the Vikings sanctified their sexual code and embedded it within the fabric of daily life. But beneath the surface of this structured cruelty lay a paradox. In creating such rigid rules around gender and intimacy, the Vikings also created pressure points, vulnerabilities where status could collapse in an instant. One whispered accusation, one night of perceived weakness, one gesture interpreted the wrong way, and everything a man had built could be taken from him. In this world, power was not inherited, it was constantly performed, and those who could not play their role, whether by choice, force, or circumstance, faced exile not only from their communities, but from the very category of manhood itself. In battle, the Vikings were known for their ferocity, but it was what came after the swords were lowered that revealed the full extent of their strategic cruelty. They understood something that many empires throughout history would later imitate, that to dominate a people, you must do more than conquer their land. You must shatter their identity. Sexual violence in Viking warfare was not random or impulsive. It was orchestrated, purposeful, and devastating. The act itself was secondary to what it symbolized, the total defeat of the enemy, not only in body, but in soul. For the Vikings, emasculating a captured warrior or publicly humiliating a vanquished leader was a ritual as potent as raising a banner. These acts redefined the victim, not just in the eyes of their captors, but in the eyes of their own people. There are accounts of prisoners being stripped naked and forced to endure assaults in front of their clans with the intent not merely to harm, but to erase. After such an ordeal, the victim often could not return home, not because they were imprisoned, but because they were no longer seen as men. They had been marked, branded in a way that no scar or armor could conceal. And in many cases, the psychological destruction was so complete that death was considered mercy. This weaponization of sex was not hidden in shadows. It was public, ritualized, and deeply embedded in the Viking psyche. In many recorded cases, it was not enough to kill an enemy. Instead, warriors would perform acts meant to humiliate the defeated in front of witnesses, transforming violence into spectacle. One of the most symbolic acts was known as the shame stroke, a deliberate wound delivered to the buttocks or genitals meant to imply forced submission without requiring full assault. To modern ears, it sounds obscene. To the Vikings, it was tactical. A man who had been symbolically penetrated, whether literally or through the theatrical cutting of his body, was understood to have lost his masculine essence. In a culture where masculinity was the key to property, leadership, and legal standing, this was more destructive than death. Survivors of such treatment were often rejected by their own communities, not because of weakness in battle, but because of the sexual meaning attached to their defeat. The goal was not simply to injure the body, it was to collapse the identity. Through this logic, the Vikings elevated sexual humiliation into a language of conquest. It was a final stamp on a ruined name, a permanent reminder that power had changed hands. And just as fire could raise a village, one public act of sexual degradation could destroy generations of legacy in a single moment. Yet Viking cruelty did not stop at symbolism. In many cases, they crossed fully into the physical realm, using sexual violence as an extension of conquest. Captured leaders, especially those who had once held power, were deliberately targeted. These men were not simply punished for their resistance. They were dismantled, piece by piece, layer by layer, through systematic sexual assault meant to strip them of every remnant of authority. The logic was chilling in its consistency. For the Vikings, sex was not merely domination, it was absorption. To force an enemy into the passive role was to siphon his strength, to turn his power into yours. This was not poetic metaphor. It was a belief so deeply rooted that it informed real, deliberate action. One man's shame became another man's triumph. Sagas recount how prisoners of high rank were made examples of in public. Their humiliation was not confined to isolated cells or private chambers. It unfolded in courts, in markets, before their own followers. Each violation sent a message, not just to the victim, but to every witness. This man has been conquered in every possible way, and the consequences were lasting. Survivors who were released or escaped often found no welcome among their people. Some took their own lives, others wandered, nameless, rejected by both kin and enemy. In the eyes of their world, they had become something less than defeated. They had become defiled. This was the psychological battlefield the Vikings mastered. They won not only with weapons, but with wounds that could not be seen, only remembered. Beyond the battlefield, the Viking use of sexual dominance became institutionalized. It was no longer just a weapon used in moments of conquest. It became a sustained system, one that fed their economy and reinforced their social structure. Nowhere was this more evident than in the slave markets of Dublin, York, and other Norse trading centers, where human beings, especially women, were commodified for intimate exploitation. Unlike the freeborn, whose honor could rise or fall based on rumors or duels, slaves had no honor to lose. They existed outside the protection of law, entirely subject to the will of their masters. Viking legal codes treated sexual violence against enslaved women not as a moral crime, but as property damage. A man could be fined for raping a slave, just as he would for breaking a neighbor's fence. But fines were rare. More often, there were no consequences at all. Some sagas describe how raiding parties divided captives like livestock, reserving the most physically desirable for chieftains or high-ranking warriors. These women were not merely taken, they were displayed, traded, and often kept as living trophies of conquest. Their presence served a dual function: personal pleasure and public affirmation of status. In this way, sexual control became part of Viking infrastructure. It shaped domestic life, reinforced class divisions, and expanded the reach of male dominance into every corner of society. What began as battlefield humiliation evolved into a codified culture of possession, and with each passing generation, it grew more organized, more accepted, and more devastating. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this system was how effective it was. Word of Viking atrocities traveled faster than their ships. Entire villages and towns surrendered before the first blade was drawn, not out of military weakness, but out of terror. Terror of what would happen not to the body, but to the spirit. The Vikings had weaponized the imagination. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Women hid at the sound of approaching sails. Men who might have fought until the last breath instead dropped their swords, choosing slavery over the shame of witnessing their families violated in ways that could not be undone. And so, without lifting an axe, Viking dominance spread. This was not a side effect of war. It was a core strategy. The genius of their cruelty lay in its permanence. Lands could be reclaimed. Wealth could be redistributed. But shame, once planted, was generational. The memory of violation lingered in stories, in names, in the silence of descendants who refused to speak of what had happened. Viking power was not only political or military, it was psychological, and it left scars that no treaty could heal. By turning sexual violence into a language of control, the Vikings built something far more enduring than empires. They built myths, and those myths would shape the ceremonies, the laws, and the beliefs of an entire world. Nowhere would this fusion of sex, violence, and belief become more vivid than in the rituals of marriage and death, where dominance was no longer a battlefield tactic, but a sacred tradition. In Viking society, sex did not always wait behind closed doors. It was sometimes watched, sometimes recorded, and often expected to unfold under the careful eye of law and kin. Nowhere was this more disturbingly evident than in the rituals of marriage. A Viking wedding was not simply a celebration. It was a contract, sealed not with signatures, but with the bride's body. And that contract required proof: physical, audible, and if necessary, witnessed. After the formal exchange of gifts and oaths, the bride and groom were escorted to their marriage bed. But they were not left alone. Family members, priests, and even village elders might remain nearby, listening for the unmistakable sounds of consummation. In some cases, trusted relatives were permitted to stay inside the chamber to bear witness and confirm the act had occurred. These were not isolated customs. They were legal obligations. If no witnesses could verify that penetration had taken place, the marriage could be declared invalid and the bride's dowry returned. Worse, accusations of impotence or non-virginity could trigger lawsuits, social disgrace, and feuds between families. And so, sex on the wedding night was not about intimacy. It was about documentation. Blood-stained sheets were preserved as evidence. Public announcements were made the next morning. In some cases, the sheets themselves were paraded as physical proof of the bride's chastity and the groom's capability. The bedroom became a courtroom, and the act of love became a performance, judged by tradition, legality, and honor. The ritual did not stop at the bedroom door. From the very start of the wedding ceremony, sexual symbolism was woven into every gesture, every word, every object. One of the most striking moments came when the officiant, often a local priest, placed Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, into the bride's lap. To the Vikings, this was no mere blessing. It was a divine metaphor for fertilization, a silent but universally understood assertion that the woman was now open to receive both lineage and legacy. The hammer, passed from hand to hand, carried sacred weight. Guests would touch it, murmur prayers, sometimes laugh nervously, but always respect the message it conveyed. Fertility was not just hoped for, it was demanded. The success of a marriage, and often the future of entire clans, rested on the assumption that this symbolic act would soon be made literal. Then came the removal of the bride's crown. This too was no simple tradition. When the groom took it off in front of the gathered witnesses, he was announcing more than the start of their union. He was declaring possession. The crown had represented the woman's virginity, her independence, and her prior status. Its removal marked a transformation. From daughter to wife, from individual to vessel of inheritance. It was a silent moment, but its meaning echoed across generations. Through these rituals, the Vikings made it clear that sex was not only expected, it was sanctified. And when sanctified acts failed, the consequences were not private heartbreaks, but public crises. But it was in death, not marriage, where Viking sexuality reached its most extreme and ritualized form. The passing of a great chieftain was not mourned with silence. It was marked by days of preparation, intoxication, and ultimately, sacrifice. In these funerals, sexuality was transformed into spiritual currency, a means of ensuring the dead retained their strength and status beyond the grave. The most harrowing example comes from the eyewitness account of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who in the year 922 observed a Viking funeral along the Volga River. He described how a young female slave, chosen to accompany her master into the afterlife, was treated not as a grieving follower, but as a vessel for ritual transfer. Over several days, she was plied with alcohol, surrounded by chants, and passed between men, each one believing his act gave strength to the dead chieftain. These encounters were not hidden. They were ceremonial. Witnesses stood nearby. Some offered gifts, others gave blessings. The slave girl, drugged and dazed, was told that she was honored to carry her lord's legacy into the realm of the gods. Her suffering was reframed as devotion. When the day of cremation arrived, she was led onto the funeral ship, embraced one final time, and then slain, strangled by a cord and stabbed by a ritual executioner known as the Angel of Death. Her body was laid beside her master's, surrounded by weapons, jewels, and other offerings. The ship was then set ablaze, flames rising with chants of eternal glory. To the Vikings, this was sacred. To modern eyes, it is almost impossible to comprehend. This ritual was not an isolated anomaly. Archaeological discoveries across Scandinavia have confirmed that the practice of sacrificing women during high-status funerals was not only real, but widespread. Ship burials have been uncovered where the remains of female bodies lie beside those of noblemen, often showing signs of trauma consistent with ritual killing. One particularly infamous case, the Oseberg burial in Norway, revealed two women, one of high rank, the other possibly a sacrificed attendant, laid together in a richly decorated longship, preserved for eternity beneath layers of soil and symbolism. To the Viking mind, these sacrifices were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of transcendence. The woman did not merely die, she was transformed. Her body, used in life, became sacred in death. Her final hours were not seen as violation, but as passage, a conduit through which masculine power was transferred, not only to the next world, but to the collective identity of the tribe. This logic elevated brutality into myth. It made domination divine. It also reinforced with terrifying clarity that even in death, hierarchy remained absolute. A chieftain could not go alone into the afterlife. He required offerings, he required flesh, and the community, rather than mourning the girl, celebrated her as chosen. This is how a culture codifies violence, not by denying it, but by sanctifying it, turning pain into purpose and sacrifice into salvation. Taken together, Viking marriage and funeral rites reveal a civilization that embedded sexuality into the very architecture of its rituals. It was not enough to control bodies in life. That control had to be enshrined in law, sanctified in belief, and performed in the most sacred moments, at the union of bloodlines and at the threshold of death. In these moments, the individual disappeared. The bride was no longer a person, but a legal vessel for property and lineage. The sacrificed slave was no longer a victim, but a sacred courier of masculine power. And the community, bound by myth and memory, looked on not with horror, but with reverence. This is what made Viking society so enduring and so unsettling. It did not separate the sacred from the violent. It made them one. The fusion of sex, ritual, and hierarchy created a system where domination was not merely permitted, it was demanded. And this system, while brutal, was also astonishingly organized. Roles were assigned, outcomes were predicted, and those who deviated faced punishment, not only in this life, but in the imagined lives beyond. As we move from ritual to reality, from myth to law, the question arises, in a society where domination was sacralized, what place remained for women? Not just as daughters, wives, or slaves, but as agents of their own power. To speak of women in Viking society is to speak in contradictions. Few cultures in early medieval Europe offered women as much legal and economic freedom as the Norse, and yet few others codified their subjugation so brutally when those same women fell outside the bounds of privilege. In the world of the Vikings, gender was not a fixed sentence. It was a position on a battlefield that shifted constantly between power and peril. Freeborn Viking women could inherit land, divorce their husbands, conduct business, and demand satisfaction in court. A wife who was unsatisfied in her marriage, emotionally, sexually, or politically, had legal grounds to end it. If a husband failed to perform his duties in bed or appeared weak in the eyes of his kin, the consequences could be severe. Public humiliation, loss of standing, complete reversal of household authority. Some women wielded immense influence. Sagas tell of matriarchs who arranged marriages for their sons, led voyages across dangerous seas, and even commanded trade networks that stretched across the known world. These women were not exceptions, they were possibilities, outcomes of a legal structure that, for a select class, recognized the female voice as something more than ornamental. But this autonomy had a cost. It depended entirely on birth, status, and protection. Outside the shield of family or law, the same society that praised strong women could destroy them without hesitation. Beneath the visible freedoms of noblewomen and merchant widows lay an invisible majority, women who had no names in the sagas, no rights in the law, and no protection under the gods. These were the enslaved women, the captives taken during raids, bought and sold in markets, used not as people, but as instruments. For these women, there was no court to appeal to, no dowry to negotiate, no ritual to protect their bodies. Their gender did not elevate them, it condemned them. In Viking legal texts, the rape of a free woman could warrant death. The rape of a slave was considered damage to property, punishable by a fine, if punished at all. This legal distinction was not an oversight, it was deliberate. By elevating the rights of free women, Viking society made the degradation of enslaved women appear acceptable by comparison. Consent became a privilege tied to class, and in doing so, the system created a powerful illusion of gender equity, while simultaneously reinforcing one of the most brutal hierarchies of the medieval world. Even more disturbing was the way enslaved women were integrated into religious and domestic life. They were not hidden. They were present in rituals, in households, even in ceremonies. They served at weddings, in childbirth, and at funerals, not as honored participants, but as living reminders of the price of freedom. Their silence was not just expected, it was enforced, and their suffering, though normalized, was foundational. What made this hierarchy even more complex was that the very women who held power often became the enforcers of the system that oppressed others. Viking society did not split neatly between male oppressors and female victims. Instead, it produced women who actively participated in maintaining the dominance of their class, sometimes through trade, sometimes through silence, and sometimes through blood. In the sagas, there are stories of wives who urged their husbands to raid more fiercely, to take more captives, to assert their dominance without hesitation. These were not passive observers. They were architects of violence, driven not only by loyalty, but by the knowledge that their own security depended on the subjugation of others. There are accounts of women who laughed as slaves were punished, who orchestrated humiliations, who selected captives for sexual use or ritual offering. These women did not see themselves as betraying their gender. They saw themselves as preserving their station. In a world where freedom was fragile and power always conditional, protecting one's place often meant enforcing the line that kept others beneath it. This is the uncomfortable truth of Viking womanhood. Empowerment in this world was not universal. It was built on the backs of those who could never speak, never resist, and never rise. And so, even in a society where some women commanded ships and shaped dynasties, the foundation remained the same. A world where gender and class were fused into a brutal code of survival. If Viking women held such power, why then were so many never given a chance to live? Buried within the romanticized tales of shield maidens and merchant queens lies a quieter, more devastating truth. In many Norse households, the birth of a daughter was not met with celebration. It was met with calculation, and sometimes with silence that lasted forever. The sagas mention it only in passing, as if it were no more controversial than harvesting grain. Fathers, upon inspecting their newborns, could choose to keep or expose them. The act of exposing a child meant leaving the infant outside, unprotected, to be taken by the cold, by animals, or by time. It was not considered murder. It was considered a decision. Male infants were almost always preserved, future warriors, heirs, builders of clans, but female infants, especially in poor families or during times of scarcity, were seen as burdens. Too many daughters meant too many mouths to feed, too many dowries to pay, and too little return. This quiet practice of erasure, systematic, unspoken, and repeated across generations, reveals the most brutal truth of all, that Viking society, despite its proud women and progressive laws, still valued life along the lines of usefulness and control. A woman could rise, yes, but only if she survived the first night. The paradox of Viking womanhood lies not only in how women were treated, but in how they were remembered. Modern fascination with Norse culture often latches on to the image of the shield maiden, a fearless warrior, equal to any man, charging into battle with a blade in hand and freedom in her heart. And while such women did exist, their stories represent the exception, not the rule. They are echoes amplified by myth, not reflections of a common truth. For every Lagertha who rose to command, there were hundreds of unnamed women who labored, endured, and disappeared. For every queen who dictated marriages and forged alliances, there were countless slaves who could not speak. For every divorce initiated by a dissatisfied wife, there were daughters abandoned to the frost because their future was deemed unworthy of investment. Viking society gave women space to rise, but only within limits, and often at the expense of others. Gender was not a shield. It was a filter through which power passed unevenly, cruelly, and selectively. The strong survived, the privileged ruled, and the rest became tools, tokens, or ghosts. Yet within this system, some who broke the rules, who stepped outside the expected roles of man and woman entirely, found themselves feared, reviled, and sometimes revered. These were the ones who refused to fit, and their stories would challenge the very structure the Vikings worked so hard to enforce. In a culture obsessed with control, hierarchy, and sexual dominance, one might expect Viking society to draw rigid lines around gender, and in many ways, it did. Men were expected to be assertive, aggressive, and always the initiators of power. Women were either honored or erased, depending on their role and status. But not everyone fit within these boundaries, and those who existed between or beyond them occupied a strange and often dangerous space. The Vikings had no modern vocabulary for queerness, yet their world was full of it. They told stories of gods who changed shape, shifted gender, and bore children. They feared men who practiced sed, a form of magic associated with women, said to involve divination, manipulation, and spiritual intimacy. Such men were not only mistrusted, they were suspected of having crossed into forbidden territory, abandoning their masculinity by embracing feminine traits. And yet, these same men were also feared, even revered, for their powers. It is in this contradiction that Viking gender ideology becomes most revealing. Those who broke the binary were punished, but also needed, exiled, but consulted, mocked, but never ignored. Their presence exposed the limits of the Viking worldview, because to control society through sex and gender, one must first believe those categories are fixed. But magic, belief, and human nature rarely obey such rules. Unlike later Christian societies that condemned homosexuality outright, the Vikings did not criminalize same-sex acts in and of themselves. Instead, they judged them through the lens of power. The issue was not whom you desired, it was how you expressed that desire, and more specifically, what role you played. A man who took the dominant position in a sexual act with another man might suffer no social penalty. He could even be praised, especially if the encounter occurred with a captive, a slave, or an enemy. In these cases, the act reaffirmed his superiority. But to be the passive one, to be penetrated, was to risk everything. The stigma was so intense that simply accusing a man of being on the receiving end could justify violence, even murder, under Viking law. This system made queer behavior both permissible and perilous. It allowed for the existence of fluid relationships, but only within a tightly policed framework. Masculinity remained the currency. As long as a man retained his role as conqueror, his behavior could be excused. But if he slipped, if he submitted, he could lose his rights, his status, even his life. The same rules applied in domestic settings. A man's sexual role, whether with women or men, defined his social identity. This extended beyond the bedroom. It shaped how he was seen in court, in battle, and in family negotiations. To be passive, in any context, was to risk emasculation. In this way, the Vikings embedded queerness not in morality, but in hierarchy. Perhaps the most fascinating and unsettling figures in Viking gender cosmology were the male practitioners of CD, a powerful and feared form of magic associated with femininity, sexuality, and the unraveling of fate. These men, often draped in robes deemed effeminate and performing rituals tied to fertility and divination, were considered transgressive by definition. Not because their magic was ineffective, but because it worked. To wield Sid was to channel forces thought to belong to women, spirits, and the dead. It required submission, not to men, but to realms the average Viking man was taught to fear. It involved entering altered states, speaking with gods, manipulating desire, and sometimes blurring the lines between the living and the ancestral. Those who practiced it were often mocked, called ergi, a term more scathing than any accusation of cowardice or treason. Yet they were also sought out. A chieftain might banish such a man from his hall, only to call him back in secret to curse an enemy, bless a voyage, or predict the outcome of a blood feud. The gods themselves reflected this contradiction. Odin, the chief deity, was said to have practiced seed, and for that, even he was ridiculed by other gods, accused of femininity and moral weakness. But Odin's power was never questioned. His authority remained absolute. This duality, condemnation and dependence, defined the Viking relationship with gender non-conformity. The farther one stepped from the expected, the closer one came to the sacred, and the price of that closeness was always isolation. In the Viking worldview, gender was not simply biological. It was mystical, it was legal, and it was performative. Masculinity could be earned or lost. Femininity could be feared, weaponized, or sanctified. And those who dared to live outside these lines often existed in a strange, liminal space. Not entirely human, not entirely divine, but essential to the functioning of the cosmos. These individuals, whether men practicing Sid, women refusing domestic roles, or lovers transgressing expectations, acted as mirrors. They reflected the anxieties of their society, its obsession with power, its fear of vulnerability, and its awe of what could not be fully controlled. In pushing against boundaries, they revealed how fragile those boundaries truly were. To label Viking society as either tolerant or oppressive would be to misunderstand its complexity. It did not erase queerness. It codified it. It did not forbid gender variance. It contextualized it, often violently, but always with recognition. Those who crossed lines were punished, yes, but they were also written into myth, feared in silence, remembered in whispers. This was a world where power was measured not just in war, but in identity. And identity, when shaped by desire, magic, and defiance, became a battlefield as contested as any blood-soaked field. In Viking lands, to be different was to be marked, but to be marked was also sometimes to be unforgettable. In Viking society, justice was not merely about punishment, it was about spectacle. Laws were enforced not behind closed doors, but in front of communities who watched, listened, and often cheered. Public execution was not the end of a story. It was a performance, carefully designed to reinforce power structures and cultural codes. And nowhere was this more evident than in the punishments tied to sexuality. Crimes of a sexual nature, whether real, rumored, or symbolically charged, were met with responses as theatrical as they were brutal. A man convicted of rape might be sentenced not only to death, but to humiliation before death. In some cases, he was subjected to acts meant to mirror his crime, his body violated, stripped, or scarred in a way that reversed his role from predator to prey. Adulterers faced castration, sometimes carried out before an audience that treated the punishment as entertainment. The crowd did not look away. They leaned in, not just for justice, but for catharsis. In these moments, the public appetite for control, revenge, and affirmation of social order was fed in the most primal way possible. Sex and violence were fused, not in private bedrooms or secret chambers, but on platforms, in courtyards, in front of children who would grow up knowing exactly what happened to those who transgressed. This was not just punishment. It was ritualized horror disguised as righteousness. But Viking justice did not end with punishment. It evolved, sometimes grotesquely, into a form of community entertainment. Certain festivals, seasonal gatherings, and public ceremonies featured what can only be described as staged humiliations. Captured enemies, disgraced slaves, or convicted criminals were forced to perform acts that blended torture, sexuality, and mockery into a single, unforgettable show. These spectacles served multiple purposes. They reaffirmed the social order by literally placing the condemned beneath the crowd. They satisfied communal thirst for vengeance, often in ways that made cruelty feel righteous. And they trained the next generation, through horror, laughter, and applause, to internalize the rules of power. One saga tells of prisoners being forced to simulate sexual acts with animals, while townspeople placed bets on how long they would survive the ordeal. Others describe convicted traitors being paraded in female garments, their bodies painted and exposed, before being publicly mutilated. The goal was never simply death, it was degradation. It is easy to mistake these stories for exaggeration, but archaeological findings support them. Bodies have been unearthed bearing signs of ritualized genital mutilation, staged dismemberment, and other methods of symbolic violence. These were not improvised horrors. They were deliberate, rehearsed, and remembered. Through these events, Viking communities turned justice into theater, not because they were uniquely cruel, but because they believed that fear was the strongest mortar for any wall meant to hold a society together. None of this was chaos. None of it was accidental. To the Vikings, violence was never merely violence. It was messaging. It was structure. It was a performance through which society explained itself, its laws, its taboos, its ambitions. And by binding sexuality to punishment, and punishment to public ritual, they ensured that every body became a lesson, every scream a warning, every humiliation a reinforcement of order. In such a system, the line between justice and cruelty blurred until it vanished. Acts that might, in another context, seem barbaric were framed as moral necessities. A man stripped naked and bound in front of his children was not being tortured. He was being corrected. A woman paraded for perceived infidelity was not being shamed. She was being purified. The crowd did not flinch. It nodded. This is how cruelty sustains itself. Not with silence, but with song. Not in the shadows, but under torchlight. It becomes tradition. It becomes law. And when that law is finally written in flesh, not stone, the people remember, because they have watched, because they have clapped, because they have cheered as others were broken to keep the world intact. This is how a civilization ensures obedience, not only with the blade, but with the stage. The Vikings are remembered as conquerors, as sailors, as builders of kingdoms and destroyers of empires. But beneath the ships and swords lies a legacy far more intimate and far more unsettling. It is the legacy of how a society used sex not for pleasure, but for power, not for love, but for law, not for unity, but for hierarchy. Their rituals are gone, their laws dissolved, but their influence lingers in the myths we tell, in the definitions we assign to strength and weakness, in the subtle ways society still links domination to desire. The belief that power must be proven through conquest, that masculinity requires performance, that shame can silence truth. These ideas did not burn away with the Viking longships. They survived. They adapted. You can find echoes of them in our institutions, our stories, even our relationships. Because systems built on control rarely die, they evolve. To study the Vikings is not just to look backward, it is to look inward, to question the roots of our own assumptions, the hidden scaffolding beneath our modern values. What does it mean to rule through the body? What does it cost to make someone a symbol? And what happens when violence becomes tradition? These are not ancient questions. They are ours. And if the story of the Vikings has shaken you, then you are ready for what comes next. Because this was only one civilization. There are others, each with their own secrets, each with their own shadows. What other truths lie buried beneath the ruins of ancient empires? What other cultures turned intimacy into law, turned shame into strategy, turned belief into blood? If this journey through Viking sexuality, power, and ritual has left you unsettled, then you are exactly where you need to be. Because history is not meant to comfort, it is meant to challenge. And sometimes, the most revealing stories are the ones we were never supposed to remember. Tell us, what civilization should we uncover next? Which empire's hidden desires, unspoken rules, and secret cruelties do you want exposed? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this video with those who think they know history. And if you have not yet subscribed, now is the time. Because this is only the beginning. The past is not dead. It is not even past.